Conference USA has been absolutely decimated by conference realignment. Whoo, boy, what's going to happen now as they bring together a group of 9 teams that's trying to figure out who are we and who's going to win this thing.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there. I'm your host, Isaac Schade. Joining me as he does every week is our guy, Leif Thulin. And we want to thank you for making our show your first listener watch every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Jace Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jace case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jacemedical.com. All right, folks, we're continuing today our conference preview series where we're previewing every single college basketball conference, all 32 of them, including 30-minute shows for the Power 6 plus the WCC, A10, AAC, and the Mountain West. And today, we hit Conference USA. Now, here's the thing. Our plan is usually like, hey, we're going to do 2 segments on like the mid-major and smaller major conferences and smaller conferences. But, Leif, this conference, the Power USA, is absolutely wackadoodle with everything that's happened to it, and it just needs its own show. And so that's what we're diving in on today, because let's just start with storylines. The biggest one is that there's just so much turnover. And I want to start by looking at it in terms of the trickle-down effect of the Big 12 realignment, which has worked its way down to where it has affected Conference USA, and want to have a big picture conversation about what this realignment is doing to the landscape of college basketball. So let me just set up that realignment so we all follow the path of it. This year we have 4 new teams in the Big 12. Obviously, you've got BYU coming from the West Coast Conference, but 3 of those teams, Houston, UCF, and Cincinnati, are coming over from the AAC. So as those teams leave the AAC, they have to be replaced by some teams. So you got 6 teams, 6 coming into the AAC from Conference USA this year. That's Charlotte, FAU, North Texas, Rice, UAB, and UTSA, UT San Antonio. So then that means the Conference USA needs to now fill in because they've gone from all these teams that they've had and they need to replenish. So then we get 4 teams, Jacksonville State, Liberty, New Mexico State, and Sam Houston State coming in to the CUSA this year, with one more, Kennesaw State, coming next year. So right now we have 9 teams in Conference USA, and next year we'll add a 10th. Leaf. All this conference realignment is wacky, but it's like when a coach leaves, then you got to fill that one, and then you got to fill that one, and there's this whole path, this chain reaction that happens. Man, what's it doing? Not just to Conference USA, but to the whole landscape of college basketball. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think conference realignment particularly decimated the Conference USA, but in general, I think they have made some fun matchups. Like the Big 12 is a winner of conference realignment. Like you're going to get Arizona in there next year, and you're going to have another basketball power. You already have Houston. BYU's historically been good. Cincinnati has had runs. And so I think the Big 12 is a winner. I think the AAC, like you can look at this and say, okay, the AAC grabbed a team that just made the Final Four. Like that's a big win in terms of getting Florida Atlantic. But I think too many teams and too many conferences are left barren because of greed. And that bothers me as someone who loves like the history of college basketball. And I'm not saying that change can't happen. Like if I were saying that, then Kansas and Missouri would still be playing the border war every year. And they wouldn't be in different conferences. So it's happened before, but at the level it's happened just for monetary TV deals is bothersome because it ruins matchups, it ruins conferences. Like, what is the Pac-12? There's 2 teams left. Like, for instance, I've grown up a Stanford fan. Stanford's in the ACC now. Like, yeah. that bothers me because the Pac-12, I think, was a good historical conference. And I'm not saying they were the best basketball conference, but there's no representatives. I mean, Oregon State and Washington State are going to be gone. So I think the conference in terms of teams decimated the most is probably Conference USA behind the Pac-12.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the Pac-12. It feels like Conference USA was the Pac-12 getting just obliterated before the Pac-12 got obliterated. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think what you said there was direct and true. Like, this is all ultimately because of greed that's leaving some of these conferences barren, but it is what it is. Now, obviously, Conference USA has survived, so fingers crossed that the same can be true for the Pac-12 somehow, some way. Now, as we get in, Leaf, to talking more specifically about Conference USA and these changes, let me just name off these 9 teams so we can make sure. I mean, it's almost complete turnover from year to year. In 21-22, there were 14 teams in Conference USA. And then last year, they lost Old Dominion, Marshall, and Southern Miss to the Sun Belt. And then now we are to the point where this year, the current makeup, literally none of the original members of Conference USA are still in this conference. The longest tenured teams in Conference USA, Leaf, Florida International, FIU, Louisiana Tech, and Middle Tennessee State. And they've only been in this conference since 2013. So it's wild to think about. Now, here's the nice thing about getting down to 9 teams is that in terms of conference play, you get a true round robin, home and home 16-game conference slate. And I think that gives a better representation of who our regular season champion is, that they've survived whatever that gauntlet is and come in. So here are the 9 teams of Conference USA right now. The holdovers are FIU, Louisiana Tech, Middle Tennessee State, UTEP, and Western Kentucky. And then those 4 new teams I mentioned, Jacksonville State and Liberty coming over from the ASUN, and New Mexico State and Sam Houston State coming over from the WAC. So, Leave, when we look at that, you know, I mean, here's the deal. The Conference USA had a ton of postseason success last year. As you mentioned already, FAU was in the Final Four. The NIT, the championship game, was 2 CUSA teams, North Texas and UAB. And then the CBI was won by Charlotte. But here's the problem. All 4 of those are teams that are now gone. And as we continue to look at the turnover, I was looking of last year's top 20 scores in Conference USA. Only 3 of them are back this year. 17 of last year's top 20 scores in the conference are no longer in it, either from transfer or because of this realignment or going pro. The only of those that return are Isaiah Crawford from Louisiana Tech, Tay Hardy from UTEP, and Arturo Dean from FIU. And the same, it's not just the top scorers. The same is true of all the postseason awards. Player of the Year, Tyler Perry, gone. Coach of the Year, Dusty May, gone. Defensive Player of the Year, Jamarian Sharp, gone to Ole Miss. 6th Man of the Year, John L. Davis from FAU, gone. Newcomer of the Year, Kai Hunsberry, gone. Freshman of the Year, that's the only award that's back. All 5 first-teamers, gone. All 5 second-teamers, gone. All defensive team, only 1 is back, Arturo Dean. And so, Leaf, as we look at this turnover, it's hard to kind of make much sense of what to expect from the conference this year. Is that kind of where you're at on it?
Yeah, I mean, I started thinking about my first team all conference, and I would cross-reference it with, okay, are they still in the conference?
Yeah.
And because I was just trying to think of good basketball players. And I watch a ton of basketball, so I was like, oh, surely. And then I'd think about it, and I'd be like, wait a minute, he's not there. And then I even missed a few where I was like, oh, okay, I'd type this in. I like my pick. And then and surely, like, Rice was no longer in the conference. I thought I had a good option. So the way I think the conference is going to be won is by who can create the most chemistry while adding a powerful player. And by that, I mean, and I don't want to give away our next segment, but I think Louisiana Tech has a really good chance to surprise people because they add a player that's established at the Power 5 ranks, transfers down, quote unquote, and then the rest of their team is more or less intact as opposed to some of the like absolute retooling of rosters that other teams have to deal with.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, it's just like you just don't know. Like, as you said, there's hopes and expectations, and we think this works and we think this will gel. But will it? We won't know until early November when we actually see these teams playing on the court. Also, there is like a cricket in my room with me right now. So if anyone's hearing that, I apologize. Such is life and nature, I guess. Now, folks, New Mexico State had a wacky offseason last year. We need to talk, or not offseason, during the season, excuse me. We need to talk about what happens, how they rebound from it, and then we'll get into some other things like the coaching carousel and some of what we're expecting. We'll have that conversation all coming up in just a second. But first, I need to tell you that this episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by our friends at Jace Medical. And what would happen if you found yourself cut off from modern medical care and treatment? I'm guessing that just like me, you probably would not be prepared. Maybe it's because of a natural disaster, or you're on an outdoor adventure. Or maybe you're like me and life's just so busy that you don't have time to schedule a doctor's appointment and go get medicine there. And so if that's you, you need the Jace case from Jace Medical, which provides 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use. All it takes to get this Jace case is you fill out a simple online form, and then you get prescription life-saving medications delivered right to your door. I love it because the Jace case gives you peace of mind so that you're not just hoping you have access to medication in an emergency. Jace Medical makes sure you have it in hand. So save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jace Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using my code LOCKEDON at checkout on jacemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com. Doctor created, doctor recommended. That's Jace Medical. We want to remind you that coming up on Friday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern is Locked On College Football Kickoff Live, coming at you on every Locked On College YouTube page every Friday. Get ready for this weekend's college football action with Locked On College Football Kickoff Live. Make sure to check it out. Leif, New Mexico State. What a mess of a 2022-23 season. One of the teams that is just coming in to this conference, and that's probably for the best because they need a fresh start. To remind those who might not remember, there was a shooting last year, like in the hours leading up to New Mexico State in New Mexico playing, involving New Mexico State player Mike Peake, who unfortunately shot and killed Brandon Travis, a 19-year-old New Mexico student. Peake had been lured to New Mexico's campus by a female student, and as the two teams were set to face off, this guy, Brandon Travis, 2 others assault Peake with a bat as revenge from some previous fight. Travis and Peake both start shooting at each other. Peake, unfortunately, as I said, kills Brandon Travis. Peake himself is shot in the leg. Peake's not ultimately charged, gets off because of self-defense. And then later on in the season, we have hazing allegations. And ultimately, and thankfully, New Mexico State's season was suspended on February 10th and ultimately canceled, the final games forfeited. As expected then, on February 14th, heck of a Valentine's Day, Greg Heyer was fired along with the coaching staff. And so now, Leif, New Mexico State is looking for this fresh start as they move into Conference USA. And oh, by the way, they have to replace literally all 13 scholarship players. What level of any sort of success can New Mexico State expect this year under first-year coach Jason Hooten as they bring this together?
I don't think there should be an expectation for success. I think there's an expectation for growth as the season goes along. Maybe they can pleasantly surprise me or themselves even.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that because this league has so many established programs, as we already talked about, that this team, there's a lot of teams that will be growing on the fly. There's a lot of teams that are new to this level, that are new to competing with the intention of winning their conference, whereas a few of these teams have been historically doormats in their previous conferences. And there's been a few that have been super successful in lesser conferences. So we'll see what the amalgamation leads them to be in a new conference. But replacing 13 players, and it's not exactly easy to recruit after what happened. So I don't anticipate this being a like Colorado football type of thing where you have a Hall of Famer heading your program and he says, you know what, I'm going to bring a quarterback, I'm going to bring my safety, which is his son, and then a player that plays 2 ways who's the #1 recruit in the country a few years ago. That's not what's going to happen in basketball. So I'd be dubious of them having success. That said, if they have an iota of success, I think that they've got a really good coach because that's a tumultuous situation to inherit.
Absolutely. And honestly, I don't expect New Mexico State to be like the doormat of of Conference USA this year. I wouldn't be surprised if they're kind of not necessarily in the middle of the pack, but just south of the middle of the pack is probably where I would put them in terms of tiers. Speaking of coaches, we do have 3 new coaches in Conference USA this year. Obviously, we've already mentioned him, but Jason Hooten is stepping into the head coaching role at New Mexico State, coming over, interestingly, from Sam Houston State, another one of the new schools in Conference USA. They bring in Chris Mudge, and then the other brand new coach for the conference is Steve Lutz, coming in to Western Kentucky. So we have 3 brand new head coaches. And really, Leif, as we look at it, it's not like there's a ton of long tenured coaching in the conference. In fact, the longest tenured coach in the conference is one of the brand new schools. It's Richie McKay at Liberty, who was there from 07-09, then went to be an assistant under Tony Bennett at Virginia, and then came back to Liberty in 2015 and has been there since. In terms of existing CUSA schools, the longest tenured are FIU's Jeremy Ballard and Middle Tennessee State's Nick McDevitt, both there since 2018. So as we have kind of, a almost whole new conference, a hodgepodge of some new coaching stuff, Leif, what do you expect to see out of maybe some of these new coaches in new places?
I actually expect a fair amount of success because, like I said, it's not like the teams, both in terms of rosters and coaches from before, are super established. Like, you're not going into a conference with Bill Self and all these guys who expect to win. I think it's a travesty when they lose at home, that expect to win the conference, and they've had more conference championships than they do home losses. Like, that's obviously I'm choosing a very supreme example there, and that's not necessarily the case for anyone else, but the point remains of this conference to me is going to be wide open. It's going to be who can mesh the quickest with their team. I would say, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here, I think Liberty's probably my odds-on favorite to win, just because even though they're transferring conferences, they mostly return their weapons. Like, they did lose players, but they've got players from their team that were critical to a team that had success. And I think that's the thing, is how many of these teams have players that were critical to success. They may have less turnover, but they lost their best players and they were super reliant on these best players. So that's where I think these younger coaches or younger teams in general, with less experience, have a better chance than they typically would, just because so many of these teams are experiencing turnover, even if it's not necessarily like youth or inexperience related.
Well, and it's funny, Leif, you mentioned that about Liberty, for example, because we talked about that trickle down of the Big 12 realignment. Like, with each of those 3 movements, it's kind of we look at a team that made a conference jump, being one of the conference favorites at all of those. Houston going from the AAC to the Big 12. They're going to be one of the top teams in the Big 12. FAU going into the AAC. They should probably win the AAC this year. And Liberty coming into Conference USA, wouldn't be surprised to see them right at the top of the heap. So very interesting stuff there. Now, last year, this conference was 10th at KenPom, only bested by the Power 6 conferences, the Mountain West, AAC, and West Coast Conference. So we'll see how all this realignment and change, if they can kind of hold that level or not this year. And you had some high-ranked teams at the top end. Florida Atlantic was 17th, North Texas 31st, UAB 47th. Obviously, those teams are all gone now. But then you also had your bottom feeder is also gone. UT San Antonio was worst ranked at KenPom last year, 278th, and they're out the door. But in terms of these teams coming in, Jacksonville State, yes, they were low at KenPom last year, 233. But Liberty, they were 48th at KenPom. Sam Houston State was 73rd last year. And so, as you've said, you've got teams with some success that could help solidify this conference. Speaking of which, and Leif, you just went there a second ago, it's time for our awards and predictions. Leif and I are both going to project our first team all-conference player of the year, freshman of the year, all sorts of stuff like that. And we're going to pick some conference champions. So stay tuned for that coming up in just a second. But first, I need to tell you that today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel. Snap into action this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action than right now. The app is super easy to use. You can bet on all sorts of stuff like spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off this NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, Leif, this is one of my favorite things to always talk about is preseason predictions for awards, especially in a conference where, as you've already said, it is so wide open because inevitably we're about to make some picks right here and they're all going to be dead wrong and it's going to be hilarious. No, legitimately, we'll make some choices and some of them are going to be right on, but we'll probably make some others and it's going to be just off. So Leif, let's start with the players. You talked earlier about your first team, all CUSA. Let me hit it. Come with your all conference first team.
I'm going to go with, and this is not in the order of votes, just I kind of wrote it in by team. I'm going to go with Kai Tandy.
Ooh, I like it. He just missed mine. Love it.
Yeah. That one was a little bit more bold. I think the rest will be fairly well represented. Arturo Dean, the former freshman of the year from FIU. Kyle Rode, the lead contributor who was on the Liberty team under Richie McKay. I mean, they lost their top scorer, but he was second. I think he'll take a leap. Daniel Baccio from Texas Tech is now at Louisiana Tech, and that's who I was referring to. And I said they've got a potent punch transferring down, and that's why I think they'll have a better time acclimating. And I thought he was really good in spurts last year, and even as in his freshman year. And then at number 5, in terms of my first team, I couldn't decide between two Western Kentucky players. Brandon Newman is eventually who I chose from Purdue. I also will give a shout out to Dante Allen, 2 transfer guards who can shoot the ball. And I think that likely whichever one of those plays better should be leading a team for Western Kentucky that has historically had success. They're going through some turnover, new head coach.
Sure.
But Brandon Newman was a contributor on the number 1 seed last year. Despite what ended up happening to them, that's a good player. So I'll have him round out my 5.
I love that. What's crazy, Leif, is in a wide open conference, somehow we still landed on 4 of the same 5 players. So I won't rehash much of it, but I've also got Kyle Rode, forward at Liberty, Arturo Dean, the reigning freshman of the year, also part of the all defensive team last year. Daniel Baccio, man, I just think he's going to do a lot at Louisiana Tech this year. Brandon Newman, like the only dude that left Purdue after last year, coming down, as you said, to Western Kentucky. I've got those 4 guys also. And then my 5th is Tay Hardy at UTEP, a guard playing there. But also, as you said, some of those guys to watch out for. I love the Dante Allen call. I love your Kai Tandy pick. A couple others that I would mention are, Cameron Weston at Middle Tennessee State, and Isaiah Crawford. He's another one I thought about and had just right there at Louisiana Tech. So obviously lots of good players in this conference to potentially look at. So Leif, out of your 5 then, who is your player of the year for Conference USA?
I'm going to go with Daniel Baccio, just because I think it's rare you're going to see as fluid of a 7-footer as you're seeing Daniel Baccio in this type of conference, especially as some of the top teams have moved up, so to speak. Mm-hmm. I think he'll likely be a double-double guy. I'd imagine he scores north of 16 points, probably 10 boards. And I think it's hard to argue with that success. There may be a player or two that scores more than him. I just don't think they'll have more impact on a game than Baccio does.
And yes, I went back and forth. I had Baccio, and I ultimately went with Arturo Dean. And kind of for similar reasons. I think he's going to take a leap scoring wise. He had 11.9 last year for FIU, but also he's bringing out like a 5'11" dude, getting 4.1 rebounds. He had just shy of 4 assists a game, 3.8, and 2.5 steals. And so Arturo Dean was the freshman of the year. As I said, he was on the all defensive team. And so a nice, well-rounded game for Dean. And so for a similar reasoning that you went with Baccio, I'm going to go with Arturo Dean. Now, my one caveat, homie has to cut down on his turnovers. I think it was like 2.7 a game last year. Can't have that, but you take a leap after your freshman year. Speaking of freshmen, Leif, this is a conference, as we so often see with mid and low major conferences, where it's going to be dominated more by upperclassmen and experience. But there are some freshmen that get some play and get some time. Who are you choosing for your freshman of the year in Conference USA?
I'm going with David Terrell. I did some researching this, and their coach says he cannot wait to unleash David Terrell, a long lead guard who Golding labeled as an on-ball demon. And that sounds like a formula for immediate success in a conference that needs some pace, an injection of pace, some speed, tenacity. And quite frankly, there weren't that many highly rated freshmen in Conference USA, and he was among the highest. And I also just think he's got a place where he can immediately play, contribute, and start. And so I think that's really important to who has a chance to make it. I mean, sometimes it's just about opportunity, and I think he'll have the opportunity to claim this award.
I'm right with you. Terrell is my pick as well. I thought you said that all well. Let's not rehash it, but excited to see what he can do down there in El Paso this year. Leif, I got to imagine, based on who's on our first team and who you picked for your player of the year, that we probably also have the same player for our transfer of the year in this conference. But go ahead and tell me, just to make sure, who is your transfer of the year for Conference USA?
Yeah, I have him as my player of the year, so it would be weird if I didn't take Daniel Baccio. But I'll give a little bit of a shout out to another player we haven't mentioned yet. I think Davon Barnes, who's going to Sam Houston State from Texas Southern, is going to make some noise. I wouldn't be surprised if he makes first team. So instead of rehashing Daniel Baccio 16-10, and he was good at Texas Tech as a freshman, and then his sophomore year was better, and then last year he was even better. I'll talk a little bit about Davon Barnes. I think he's got a good chance, if it's not Baccio, to be the guy.
Yeah, that's so true. Because one of the truths about this conference is that in the same way as there are a bunch of transfers going out, there are also a whole ton coming in. And so this award is probably the one that's the most wide open in Conference USA. All right, Leif, before we get to our conference champion predictions and picks, let's also go with Coach of the Year.
I think this is an interesting one. I've got a new coach, and it's Chris Mudge. He was an assistant under Rick Barnes back at Texas, so quite a while ago. He was on the staff in like 2010, and then he joined Jason Hooten's staff, and we talked about him earlier today, and he'd stay up until 2023, aka last year, where he was part of 6 postseason appearances for the Bearcats after Hooten left.
Bearcats with a K.
That's true. Unlike the Cincinnati Bearcats.
That's right.
And so Hooten, as Isaac said earlier, left to accept the head coaching position at New Mexico State. Mudge was promoted to the head coaching position. So I'm taking a guy with absolutely no head coaching experience on the Division I level. The reason I'm going to take him, though, is I think sometimes you see an assistant, a long-time tenured assistant, take over at a program, and he's got respect of his team, and they tend to do well, and at least initially, there's a lot of buy-in, like, hey, we're gonna fight for this guy. And I don't think you lose the culture. Like, it wasn't like, oh, Hooten's gone, this is awful. I think a lot of those players stayed. I think Sam Houston State, by some analytical measures, is projected to be the second best team in the conference. And if you're brand new and you're going to be top 3, let's just say it ballpark at top 3, that gives you a shot to win. And so I'm going to go with a little bit of a shot in the dark there.
I love it. Now, what's funny is I'm tempted to actually pick Jason Hooten as mine. Like, anybody that replaces all 13 scholarship players, inheriting the mess that is New Mexico State, if they do anything outside of being the last place team in this conference, that's the kind of story that people vote for typically in a Coach of the Year race. But I'm actually going to go with Richie McKay at Liberty, coming into the conference for the first time. Spoiler alert, I'm about to pick Liberty as my regular season champion. And so I think this is a situation where where people will actually vote for the team that wins the regular season for a coach in his first year there. Give me Richie McKay as my Coach of the Year. So, Leif, I've just spoiled my pick as we move to conference champs. I'm going with Liberty as the regular season conference champ. Again, true home and home round robin 16-game conference slate. You mentioned earlier you liked Liberty a lot too. Are you going with them as your regular season champ?
Yeah, I am. I think the talent that could, supersede Liberty in terms of the infusion of talent would be maybe Louisiana Tech or something, but I think it takes a little longer. The well-oiled machine that is Liberty is something that I have a hard time betting against, despite being brand new to the conference. I think the conference's talent got watered down by a lot of the top teams moving up. Liberty is used to winning. I think having a normalcy about winning really matters. Their culture, their chemistry should be good. They lose a few players. This has happened. This is tried and tested, and yet we know who Liberty is each and every year. We watch them, and yes, they lost Darius McGee. That's a huge loss.
Yep.
But I do think they'll be able to score enough in a conference that's a little bit inferior compared to what they were used to, and I think I think they'll be able to do it. I do wonder about their top end talent level, having lost a guy who scored 22 a game for 4 straight years.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting about what you just said, as we then move to our conference tournament predictions, is that influx of talent at Louisiana Tech, which, yes, might take longer to come together. I think by the time we get to the conference tournament, that's the team that in that tournament scenario can actually upset and unseat Liberty, as it were. So I'm going to go with Louisiana Tech as my conference tournament champion. Leif, who are you going with?
Yeah, I had the same thought process as well. And I think they had the best player in the conference to my eye and Daniel Bacho. I think Crawford is top 7 in the conference. He just missed out on my first team. And I think he easily could be first team. And that's the best mix. No other team's got 2 players that highly rated by my eye. Maybe there's going to be someone that surprises me. But it's hard to have 2 players that would surprise me. And these guys are at least known commodities. They've had a track record for success. You've seen players really thrive, especially power forwards. If you're going to go back through the annals of time, Louisiana Tech has had a quite a success. I mean, the most recent one, Kenny Lofton, is the least heralded, and he was fantastic. Paul Millsap, Carl Malone. I mean, there's others as well, but those are the main guys. And I really think this is a team that should thrive in the front court and get enough production out of the back court to be a dangerous team come tournament time, both in the CUSA tournament and perhaps the NCAA tournament.
Yes, I'm curious to see if the new look Conference USA can replicate last year's level of success in the postseason. Hard to think that's possible because that was wild last year, but we'll see what happens. Folks, that's it for our preview of Conference USA. I hope you've enjoyed talking about it. I'm really enjoying or looking forward to keeping tabs on the Conference USA race because of how wide open it is. Should be a lot of fun. For Leif Thulin, I'm Isaac Schade. Make sure you follow us on Twitter and the show at Locked On CBB. Don't forget to subscribe on audio and video formats. Smash the like button, and we'd love to hear your comments on your CUSA predictions as well. Hey, as always, apologies to the Lawyer family. Go Wildcats, and until tomorrow, peace.